Dear Excellencies, dear Mr. Alderman, ladies and gentlemen. Monday morning and a banker holding a speech on Basel III. Might be boring, might be annoying, but I'm sure it's not the case for this audience. For those who will bear with me throughout this presentation, it will become clear that the Basel regulation is an important fact of life, whether you are a banker or a diamond dealer. We will not elaborate too much on the existing and new regulatory standards on bank capital adequacy and liquidity, as this is a very complex issue which is of limited interest to this audience. The difference between Basel II and Basel III can be summarized as the lessons learned from the financial crisis, resulting in, first of all, less leverage for banks, higher capital requirements for banks, and more efficient risk monitoring and risk weighting mechanisms. Let us instead focus on the importance of the Basel II regulations for a diamantaire. Although you might not always feel or be aware of it, the impact of the Basel regulations on your business, it is here today, and it will be even more material in the future. For example, the Basel regulations determine, first of all, your capacity to source credit, but even more important, your capacity to source credit at a reasonable, at a reasonable or correct price. Doesn't work. Yes. This presentation consists of three parts. First of all, I will give you a brief overview on the Basel regulation fundamentals and a comment on some of the expected changes between Basel II and Basel III. Secondly, the impact of these changes on the diamond finance will be highlighted. And finally, how does a rating model work and which are the determining criteria for customers' risk profile or rating. To understand the impact of Basel III on our and your business, we will have a very brief look at its fundamentals. It is important to note that the Basel regulation, including Basel III, applies to the banking sector as a whole. Observations made in this context are valid for all banks. If not yet today, certainly tomorrow or in the near future. Bank capital is limited, especially in the post-crisis era. Capital has become a scarce commodity. Under Basel III, banks will need more capital for the same amount of business. The capital adequacy standard, presently at 8%, will gradually increase to 10.5% and even further to maximum 13% over the next coming years. This will result in a lower leverage for banks and a reduced earnings capacity. Subsequently, banks will select counterparties with the best risk-reward profile. A higher risk profile will inevitably attract a much higher finance cost. Capital requirements for complex financial products will be higher. A very wide range of financial products will be affected, including a couple of well-known products to the diamond industry, as there are, first of all, derivatives, as for instance, currency and interest rate derivatives, but also structured finance, as for instance, asset-backed commercial paper programs and securitizations. Other balance sheet liabilities will be weighted as well. This is best explained by the liabilities arising from credit facilities made available to customers. Unlike today, the full amount of the facility will be taken into account when calculating the counterparty risk. So, banks will ask for compensation for capital consumption, and credit facilities will become even more tailor-made. Banks will promote those financial products with the optimum risk weighting. Other products will inevitably attract higher margins. New funding and liquidity ratios are introduced to reduce the overall over-reliability of banks on interbank short-term borrowing. New funding mechanism will come at a higher cost for banks, a higher cost that will reflect in the cost of borrowing. It's important that banks and their customers will have the time to adapt to this new regulation in a phased manner. Some standards will be introduced in the very near future, others in a couple of years. But important is that the future starts today, not tomorrow. And in the rest of this presentation, we will look at how the Basel regulation will impact on the diamond industry in general and on the diamond finance in particular. The headline conclusions for banks in general will also apply to banks financing the diamond industry. Today, worldwide finance to the diamond industry's wholesale segments are amply available as credit facilities exceed the annual rough and polished diamond production at wholesale prices. Finance is essentially provided by means of short-term loans and overdrafts with the high capital costs. Secondary sources of finance, such as structured finance, IPOs, and bond issues, are not available to the average diamond company. Finance yields mostly interest income and generates limited fee income. And finance is sometimes subsidized in terms of modalities and pricing. Forward-looking, we at ADB believe that once a level playing field is created in the domain of diamond finance, the Basel III fundamentals will start to have an impact on competitiveness and selectiveness. Finance will be adequate, but will become at a higher cost, especially for those with an inferior risk profile. Facilities will be tailor-made and subject to line fees. Secondary sources of finance might vary. Securitizations will attract higher capital requirements. Moreover, the commercial paper market has actually shrunk. This finance mode might become less attractive than it is today. Bond issues are, for the most of the diamond companies, out of scope today as they require a higher degree of corporatization. As such, banks will focus on value-adding services that create fee income. As such, we expect that the diamond industry will also become more selective in granting marking credit, and that the focus will shift from selling diamonds with credit towards selling diamonds. We expect that Basel III will lead towards further corporatization and sophistication within the diamond industry, a trend already apparent today. In order to secure finance at optimum conditions, both big and small companies, the sector as a whole, in fact, will have to strive towards more transparent operational and financial structures, increased profitability and higher capitalizations, sustainable business models, adapted corporate governance, and this in line with the company's scope, big and small. In the last section of this presentation, you will see that these criteria are used in ADB's internal rating model to define a customer's risk profile or rating. How do banks rate their customers, and which are the determining criteria? The internal rating model is totally independent and different from the credit granting process. In credit granting, a customer file is analyzed on its own merits, resulting in a credit decision. In a rating model, a customer is also compared to his peers, taking into account a number of parameters. This exercise results in a rating. The rating determines, however, how much capital the bank needs to spend on the relation and, as a result, the pricing. Of course, I cannot reveal the internal rating model of ADB, but I will give you some hints how we look at things today and even more in the future.